The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Margot Dey would later decide was fitting, because Tuesdays had always been the worst day of the week. It came from a solicitor in Medicine Hat, written in the careful hand of a man who charged by the word and had therefore chosen each one with the precision of a surgeon. It informed her that her husband, Gerald Dey, had died 6 weeks prior of a heart that had simply stopped, and that the debts attached to his name, his real name, the one she hadn't known until the solicitor spelled it out, numbered enough to take the house, the furniture, the horse, and the small account at the bank she'd believed was hers. She sat at the kitchen table in Lethbridge and read the letter twice. Outside, November rain was turning the street into gray soup. The landlord would be around on Friday. Margot was 28 years old. She had $11.40, and she had a daughter named Pearl, who was 4, and who was currently asleep in the next room with her thumb in her mouth and no idea that the floor had just dropped out of the world. The agency advertisement had been tucked into the back of a church newspaper, the kind her neighbor Mrs. Finch left on the step when she had finished with it. Frontier domestic placement, honest work for capable women, Alberta ranches and homesteads. References exchanged. No obligation beyond 90 days. There had been a post office box in Calgary and a fee of $2, which Margot could not really afford. She sent the $2 anyway. 3 weeks later, she received a letter from a man named Douglas Aldcroft, who ran a cattle operation outside of a settlement called Hartfield, in the foothills west of Calgary. The letter was short. He needed someone who could cook, keep accounts, and manage a household. He had 2 children. He was not looking for a wife. The work would be hard and the winters were long, and if she expected comfort, she should look elsewhere. It was possibly the least persuasive advertisement for any arrangement that Margot had ever read. She packed 2 trunks and bought a train ticket. The drive out from Hartfield was done in a wagon with a man named Seb, who worked for Aldcroft and who said almost nothing for the first hour except to comment that the road got worse before it got better. He was right. By the time they turned north off the main trail, the track had narrowed to twin ruts through spruce and poplar, and the November mud sucked at the wheels with a sound like something alive. Pearl sat in Margot's lap and watched the trees with the solemn attention of a child cataloging everything for later use. She hadn't complained once since Calgary. She rarely did, which Margot suspected said something about the first 4 years of Pearl's life that she preferred not to examine too closely. The ranch came into view just as the light was failing. Not all at once, but in pieces, the way things reveal themselves in the foothills when the land starts opening up. A barn first, bigger than she'd expected and in better repair. Then a cluster of outbuildings. Then the house, which was log construction with a covered porch and smoke coming steady from the chimney, and which looked like it had been built by someone who intended to stay. Seb pulled up in the yard and climbed down without ceremony. Margot waited. The man who came off the porch was tall, with the particular leanness that came from years of outdoor work rather than from not eating enough. He wore a canvas coat and no hat despite the cold, and he moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had long since stopped making unnecessary gestures. He looked at the wagon, then at Margot, then at Pearl. He did not smile, but he did not look unfriendly either. He looked like a man who had learned to withhold judgment until he had more information, which Margot found she could respect. "Mrs. Dey," he said. It was not a question. "Mr. Aldcroft." He nodded once. "Roads rough this time of year, you eat? Not since Calgary." He turned back toward the house without further discussion. She took that as an invitation. The kitchen was warm and larger than she'd anticipated, with a good iron stove and a long table that had been scrubbed so many times the wood had gone pale. A girl of about 9 sat at one end doing something with a length of yarn, and a boy who looked to be 6 or 7 was on the floor, near the stove with a wooden horse and an expression of deep concentration. Both of them looked up when Margot came in. The girl's name was Bet. The boy was called Croft, which she would later learn was a family name from Douglas Aldcroft's mother's side that he had insisted on, and which his son had grown into with the same resigned acceptance children brought to most things they hadn't chosen. "This is Mrs. Dey," Aldcroft said to them. "She'll be staying." Bet studied Margot with the frank assessment of a child who had been burned before and had decided to gather data first. Croft looked at Pearl, and Pearl looked back at Croft, and some negotiation passed between them that Margot could not interpret, but which apparently concluded satisfactorily, because Croft held out the wooden horse, and Pearl took it. Aldcroft put a plate of cold biscuits and sliced beef on the table and went back outside. Margot sat down, pulled Pearl into her lap, and ate. The first weeks were a reckoning. She had told the agency she could cook and keep accounts, both of which were true, but the scale of what Aldcroft's ranch required was different in kind from managing a house in Lethbridge. There were 4 ranch hands who ate with the family during the week. There was a root cellar that wanted organizing, a pantry that had been stocked without system, and a set of ledgers in the small room off the kitchen that recorded 5 years of ranch finances in Douglas Aldcroft's precise but idiosyncratic notation. She did not ask him to explain the notation. She worked it out herself over 2 evenings, Pearl asleep in the room they had been given, a real room with a door that latched and a window that looked east toward the mountains. When she had understood the system, she asked him one question, whether the column marked SV referred to the spring veterinary costs or to the salt blocks from Sutherland's in town. He looked at her for a moment. Sutherland's, he said. Vet costs go under M for medical. I would have put veterinary under V, she said. I would have too, he said, but I started the ledgers in a hurry, and by the time I realized I'd used V for something else, there were 3 years of entries. She recategorized nothing. She simply learned his system and worked within it. The house had not been run by a woman in 2 years. His wife Catherine had died of fever in the September before last, and in the time between, things had accumulated in the way they did when a household was held together by effort rather than habit. The curtains wanted washing. The floorboards near the stove needed attention. The children's clothes had been mended with the utilitarian competence of a man who understood that mending was necessary, but not necessarily neat. Margot worked steadily through it all, not because she was trying to prove anything, but because there was work to do, and she was the one there to do it. She was not performing capability. She simply was capable, and the distinction mattered to her, in a way she could not have easily explained. Bet watched her with that same cataloging attention for the first 2 weeks, helping with small tasks but not volunteering conversation. Croft was easier. He had Pearl now, and the two of them communicated in the wordless shorthand of children, the same age who have both in their different ways learned to be quiet. Aldcroft himself was a study in consistency. He was up before she was. He ate breakfast quickly and without comment on what was served, which she appreciated. He came in at midday for 15 minutes and went back out. He ate supper with the children and sometimes read to them, afterward, from a battered copy of A Natural History of North American Birds, which was apparently the book they had been working through for some months. He did not ask her questions about herself. He did not make demands beyond what the work required, and every few days, without being asked, he brought her firewood and stacked it neatly on the porch where she could reach it easily. She tried once to thank him for the firewood. He looked faintly embarrassed. "Cold's coming early," he said. "Stove needs to run hotter." She did not thank him again for that particular thing, but she did not forget it either. The cold came in the last week of November, with no warning and a wind from the north that drove snow horizontal across the yard. 2 of the hands, younger men who had signed on only through fall, left for Calgary. That left Seb and a man named Hart, who was 50-something, and who had apparently been on the place so long that leaving had never seriously occurred to him. The snowstorm trapped them inside for 2 days. It was the first time Margot had spent real time with Aldcroft, in the sense of being in the same room without the buffer of visible tasks between them. Bet taught Pearl to play a card game of questionable rules that they appeared to be inventing as they went. Croft fell asleep against Margot's side on the second afternoon, in the way children did when they had forgotten to maintain caution, and she sat very still so as not to wake him. Aldcroft was at the table with a harness that needed repair. He worked without looking up for a long time. Then he said, without preamble, "Catherine used to say the first bad storm was the ranch's way of asking if you intended to stay." Margot looked at him. He was still looking at the harness. "What did she decide?" Margot asked. "She stayed 11 years. He worked a new piece of leather through the buckle with practiced hands. So I suppose her answer was yes. It was the most he'd said about his wife. Margot did not push because pushing was not her nature, but she held the detail carefully. "Pearl and I are staying," she said. He nodded, still not looking up. "Good." December settled into a rhythm. The accounts became her real work, not just recording but analyzing, and she began to see the shape of the ranch's finances the way she had once learned to see the shape of a room in the dark, slowly by feel, until suddenly she knew where everything was. The numbers were not bad. They were, in fact, better than they appeared in Aldcroft's ledgers, because he had a habit of recording expenses precisely and revenues conservatively, which gave a picture of the operation that was bleaker than the reality. She mentioned this at supper one evening, because she thought he should know. He set down his fork. "Show me." She showed him. He studied her workings for several minutes in silence. She had spread them across 3 sheets of paper, organized by category, with a final column that showed the corrected projection for the spring sale. "You added this column yourself," he said. "The numbers didn't mean much without context. Where did you learn bookkeeping?" "My father ran a general store in Ontario," she said. "I helped him from the time I could add." He looked at the papers for a moment longer. Then, I've been operating as though we were $200 shorter than we are. Closer to 300, accounting for the hay you'll sell to Gillies in March." He was quiet. Then he said something she had not expected. "I should have had someone look at these 2 years ago." She did not say yes, you should have, because it wasn't her place and it wasn't useful. She just said, "You know now." He picked up his fork again. "Thank you," he said, in the tone of a man who found gratitude slightly uncomfortable, but understood it was owed. After that, the accounts were simply hers. He brought her the receipts, the tally sheets, the invoices from town. She organized them and reported to him weekly, and he listened with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely trying to understand rather than simply receiving information. Occasionally, he asked questions. Occasionally, he disagreed and told her why. She had been right more often than he had, and he acknowledged this without making a production of it. She found she respected him more for that than for anything else. Christmas came and went quietly. There was a goose and spruce boughs from the tree line, and a small gathering of the neighboring families from the 2 ranches nearest to the north. Bet had been warming toward Margot steadily since early December, in the careful incremental way of a child who wanted to trust but was rationing the want. On Christmas morning she brought Margot a small braided bracelet she had made herself from threads unraveled from an old shirt. She held it out without saying anything. Margot put it on. "It's beautiful," she said. Bet studied her face for signs of insincerity, found none, and went back to her breakfast apparently satisfied. Aldcroft across the table was pretending to be very interested in his coffee. He had made something for Pearl. She discovered it tucked beside the stove on Christmas morning, a small wooden sled, scaled for a child, with runners sanded smooth enough that even a light slope would send it flying. He must have worked on it in the evenings in the barn, in whatever hours were left after everything else. Pearl brought it immediately to show Margot, her eyes wide with the particular joy of the unexpectedly seen to. "Did you thank Mr. Aldcroft?" Margot asked. Pearl marched across the kitchen and tugged on Aldcroft's sleeve. He looked down at her with the careful expression of a man who was slightly afraid of very small children but was managing. "Thank you," Pearl said solemnly. "You're welcome," he said, equally solemn, and then Pearl went back to examining the sled, and Aldcroft looked up and caught Margot watching him and looked away again. January was brutal in the straightforward way that Alberta Januaries were brutal. Cold past reckoning, the kind that made the air feel solid, that cracked the wood of the fence posts in the night with sounds like rifle shots. The hands worked shortened days, and Margot kept the stove burning high and made soup that was more standing project than recipe, always something in the pot, always changing. It was during the 3rd week of January that she noticed the discrepancy in the feed accounts. She went over it twice before bringing it to him. A supplier out of Calgary, a company called Dunmore and Fitch, had invoiced the ranch 3 times over 8 months for a grade of oat hay that was being delivered at a grade below what was charged. The difference per delivery was small enough to miss if you were not looking at the receipts alongside the delivery logs. Across 8 months it amounted to nearly $80. Aldcroft read her notes with his jaw tightening slightly. "I should have caught this. The invoices and the logs were in different ledgers," she said. "There was no system for comparing them. There is now, presumably. I've built one." He looked at her. "What do you want to do about Dunmore?" She had already considered this. Write them formally. State the discrepancy with documentation. Give them 30 days to issue a credit or explain the variance. If they don't respond, take the documentation to the Feed Merchants Association in Calgary. Dunmore sells to at least a dozen ranches in this district. If they're doing this here, they're doing it elsewhere. Aldcroft was quiet for a moment. "You'd make a good solicitor," he said. "I'd make a poor solicitor," she said. "I have no patience for people who waste my time. But I understand numbers, and I understand when someone has done something dishonest." He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a crease at the corner of his mouth. But she had been watching his face for 2 months, and she had catalogued the difference between his neutral expression and his almost smiling expression, and this was the latter. They wrote the letter together that evening at the kitchen table, the children already in bed, the lamp between them. He wrote, she dictated. When it was done, he read out back and changed one word, discrepancy, to overcharge, which she agreed was more precise, and then folded it and addressed it. "You should have been here 2 years ago," he said, not looking at her. She did not know quite what to do with that, so she said nothing. But she sat with it for a long while after she went to bed. February brought a thaw that was not a thaw, the kind that softened the snow just enough to make everything more difficult, and then froze again overnight into a world of treacherous glass. Seb broke a rib falling near the barn and spent 2 weeks in bad temper in the bunkhouse. Hart developed a cough that Margot watched with careful concern, until he admitted it had been there since October, at which point she made him a tincture from the medicine chest, and told him straight that if it wasn't better in 10 days, she would make him go to the doctor in Hartfield. And Hart looked at her with the expression of a man who recognized an immovable object and accepted it. The cough improved. Bet had begun spending her evenings at the kitchen table while Margot worked, doing her schoolwork and occasionally asking questions about arithmetic that Margot answered, and then, by slow degrees, questions about other things. What was Ontario like? Whether Margot had always known how to cook or had learned, whether Pearl's father was dead. Yes, Margot said to the last question carefully. Bet was quiet for a moment, drawing figures in the margin of her exercise book. Our mother is dead too, she said. It's different when they're a mother, I think, than when they're a father. Why do you think so? Because mothers are there more, Bet said. So there's more places they're missing from. Margot looked at this 9-year-old girl and thought about the specific geometry of loss. That's exactly right, she said. Bet looked up from her exercise book, and for the first time there was no assessment in her face. Just a child looking. March arrived, and the Dunmore matter arrived with it. They had not received a credit. They had received instead a letter from a Dunmore and Fitch representative named Proctor, which was 3 paragraphs of polite implication that the variance was the result of record-keeping errors on the ranch's side, and that Dunmore stood behind the quality of their product. Aldcroft read it and set it on the table. They're calling me a liar, he said. They're implying your records are unreliable, Margot said, which is different but not much. What do? We go to Calgary. She had already made copies of everything, the invoices, the delivery logs, her comparison worksheet, the original letter, and now this response. I want to present this to the Merchants Association myself, and I want to speak to 2 other ranchers before we go, to find out whether they've noticed similar discrepancies. You think others have? Dunmore supplies 12 ranches in this district. If they've been doing this to us for 8 months, they've been doing it to someone else. People don't run an operation like this on one account. Aldcroft looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said, we go to Calgary. The trip took 3 days there and back. Aldcroft drove. Margot sat beside him with the documentation in a leather satchel on her lap. Pearl stayed at the ranch with Bet, an arrangement Pearl had accepted, and Bet had seemed to find quietly satisfying, in the way of a child who has been given responsibility and found she wanted it. They stopped the first night at a way station 20 miles east, a rougher accommodation than Margot would have chosen, but the only option in that stretch of country. The proprietor, a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Bretchen, looked at them with the frank curiosity of someone who processed travelers for a living, and had well-developed opinions about the categories they fell into. Husband and wife? She asked, not unkindly. Business associates, Margot said. Mrs. Bretchen's expression suggested she had heard this before and had her own theories about it. But she showed them to separate rooms without comment. They ate supper at the common table with 4 other travelers and said little to each other. But on the porch afterward, in the cold and the dark, Aldcroft stood beside her and looked at the sky. You're not afraid of this, he said. Of the trip? Of Dunmore. Of going to the association. Most people would rather absorb the loss than make a fight of it. Margot considered this. Gerald, my husband, was afraid of conflict, she said. It was the first time she had volunteered anything about Gerald, and she felt the slight strangeness of it. He avoided it in every form, which meant that problems compounded instead of being addressed. And by the time they couldn't be avoided anymore, they were much larger than they'd needed to be. She looked at the dark tree line. I found out after he died that the debts he'd left were the result of 5 years of things he'd been too afraid to face. Aldcroft was quiet. I am not afraid of difficult conversations, Margot said. I'm afraid of what happens when they don't happen. He looked at her sideways in the dark. Catherine was the same way, he said, and there was something in his voice that she recognized as grief that had been carried long enough to become part of the landscape. So familiar you almost forgot it was grief. She sounds like someone worth knowing, Margot said she was. He pushed off the porch rail. Get some sleep. Roads bad past the junction. She watched him go inside and stood alone for another minute in the cold Alberta dark, and told herself quite firmly that whatever was happening in her chest was simply the natural consequence of living in close quarters with a decent person for 4 months. She almost believed it. The Merchants Association in Calgary proved more interested than she had expected. 2 other ranchers in the district had noticed similar discrepancies, but had assumed the fault was their own. A third had raised the issue informally with Dunmore 6 months earlier and received the same style of polite dismissal as Aldcroft. By the end of 2 hours in a wood-paneled office that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, there was a collective file and a commitment to a formal investigation. The association's secretary, a spare man named Kendrick, shook Margot's hand with the focused attention of someone revising his first impression. "You've done considerable work here, Mrs. Day," he said. "The documentation existed," she said. "It only needed organizing." On the drive back, somewhere west of the junction, Aldcroft said, "You didn't mention that you'd contacted the other ranchers before we went." "I wrote 2 letters while you were in town for supplies last week," she said. "I wasn't certain they'd respond in time, and I didn't want to promise something I couldn't deliver." He was quiet for a while. The foothills were coming up ahead of them, folded and white. "You should have told me, yes," she said. "I should have. I'm used to working things out on my own before presenting them. It's a habit from before, from when presenting an incomplete thought meant it would be dismissed." She kept her eyes on the road. Gerald had no patience for work in progress. He wanted conclusions. "I got into the habit of waiting until I was certain." Aldcroft drove on. Then, "I don't want conclusions. I want to know what you're working on." She looked at him. His eyes were on the road, but there was a set to his jaw that she had learned to read as earnest, rather than stern. "Noted," she said. "Good." April arrived with mud and the beginning of calving season, which meant long nights and a particular kind of exhaustion that was different from winter exhaustion, more urgent, more contingent. Aldcroft slept in broken shifts. Hart and Seb worked doubles. Margot took over everything else entirely and expanded into the spaces that needed filling, which was how she found herself one morning at 3 a.m. in the barn, while Aldcroft was occupied at the north pasture, helping a young heifer through a difficult birth, with Hart talking her through it in his low, steady voice. It was a longer business than she had expected and considerably messier, but the calf came through and the heifer settled. And Hart looked at Margot afterward with an expression that she understood to mean she had passed some category of test that mattered to him. "Good hands," he said, which from Hart was the equivalent of a long speech. She washed up at the barn pump and went back to the house to start breakfast, and she was at the stove when Aldcroft came in at 4:30. He looked at her and took in whatever it was in her expression or her hands or the set of her shoulders that told him what had happened. "The heifer in the second pen," he said. "Calf's fine, both are." He pulled out a chair and sat down as though his legs had made the decision without him. "Hart was with you?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then, "Thank you." "The coffee's ready," she said, because it was, and because she understood that some moments were better served by practical things. He got himself a cup. She finished the eggs. They sat at the table in the early morning dark, the lamp between them, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing in particular that needed saying. It was the first time in Margot's adult life that silence with another person had felt like rest rather than absence. She noticed that too. May came. The snow withdrew up the mountain slopes, and the grass came in green and urgent, and the ranch shifted into its spring mode, which was a different kind of work from winter work. Less about endurance and more about pace, about doing 100 things in the right sequence before the short growing season demanded the next 100. Margot found herself riding out occasionally with Aldcroft to check on pasture condition, not because she was a horsewoman. She was tolerable, no more, but because the conversation was easier on horseback than it was at the table, where there was always something else to attend to. She had started to understand him in the way you understood country you'd been living in long enough, not by studying it consciously, but by accumulating detail until the pattern was visible. She knew his silences now. The comfortable ones from the pressed ones, the tired ones from the ones where he was working something over. She knew he felt the loss of his wife most in the evenings, when the house went quiet and the children were in bed, and the shape of who should have been there was its own presence. She knew he was harder on himself than he was on anyone else, and that he would not tolerate the reverse. She had watched him correct Hart's account of a fence repair twice to make Hart's role in it sound larger than he initially gave himself credit for. She did not know what he made of her. She suspected he had filed her initially under a category he'd had to revise, and that the revision had been ongoing, and that somewhere in the accounting of it he had landed somewhere that she could not entirely read. It was Bet who said it plainly, as children sometimes did. Margot was braiding Bet's hair one morning before school when Bet said, to the mirror in front of them, "Papa looks at you different than he looks at everyone else." Margot kept braiding. "What do you mean? Like he's paying attention?" Bet said. "He pays attention to everything on the ranch, checking whether things are all right. But when he looks at you, it's different. He's not checking, he's just looking." Margot tied off the braid. "Off you go," she said. She spent the rest of the morning paying very close attention to the pantry inventory. The Dunmore resolution came in June. The Merchants Association had substantiated the overcharges across 4 ranches and levied a significant fine. Aldcroft received a bank draft for $93, which was the adjusted total owing to his account, and a letter of formal apology that was precisely as satisfying as formal apologies generally were. He brought both to the kitchen table and set them in front of her. "This is yours," he said. "The work was yours. The money belongs to the ranch," she said. "The accounts are yours, Margot." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it stopped her entirely. He looked at her steadily, the way he looked at things when he had made a decision and was simply executing it. "This was your work. The fact that it benefited the ranch doesn't change that." She looked at the bank draft. "Put it in the spring cattle account," she said. "And at year end, if the margins are where I think they'll be, we can discuss whether my wages want adjustment." He held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted in it, not toward anything exactly, but the distance in it diminished by some degree that she could feel rather than measure. "All right," he said. That evening he sat with the children for their reading hour, and then, after they were in bed, came back to the kitchen where she was finishing the May accounts. He did not have anything particular to do. He sat down across from her with a cup of coffee and simply stayed there, quiet, while she worked. It was not a novel situation. He had done it before, when there were ledger questions to wait on. But it was different now, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed it. When she finally closed the ledger, it was past 10. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you." She looked at him across the lamp. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly, even if the answer is no." He put down the cup. "All right, the 90 days that the agency specifies," she said. "The initial term. That ended in February," he said. "I know. I've been staying past it because the work needed doing, and because Pearl and I had nowhere that made more sense to go." She kept her voice steady. "I want to know whether you want us to stay. Not whether it's practical. Not whether it benefits the ranch. Whether you want us here?" The lamp put light on the planes of his face and left the rest in shadow, and she watched him very carefully. "Yes," he said, simply without qualification, which was more than she had expected and exactly what she needed. She nodded. "Then we stay." He reached across the table and turned the lamp up slightly, so they could both see a little better. It was such a small thing it might have meant nothing, but she knew him well enough now to understand that the things he did rather than said were the more honest record. "Good," he said, and picked up his coffee. Summer passed in the way, summers passed in the foothills, fast and full, the days so long that dark felt provisional, the work punishing in the best sense, the kind that left you too tired for anything but sleep and made the sleep profound. Pearl turned 5 in July, and Croft turned 7 in August, and Bet turned 10 in September. And there was cake for each occasion, modest and certain, and Margot found that she had learned to mark time by this family's milestones without noticing the transition. There was no dramatic declaration, there was no single moment. There was instead a slow accumulation of ordinary things. The mornings when she handed him coffee and their hands were briefly close. The evenings when she fell asleep in the chair by the stove and woke to find a blanket placed over her with a care that left no trace of the placer. The afternoon in late August when she was mending on the porch, and he came and sat beside her and said nothing at all for an hour while the light went out of the sky. And the particular quality of that nothing at all was such that she understood it had been chosen. She understood him now the way she understood the ranch ledgers, not because she'd studied them once and memorized them, but because she had been attending for long enough that the logic had become her own. In October, on a morning that was bright and sharp and smelled of wood smoke and frost, he asked her to marry him. He did it at the kitchen table, without ceremony, in the quiet after the children had left for the school wagon. He said her name first, so she knew something was coming. And then he said that he had not been looking for this, that he had told himself clearly, and more than once, that he was not looking for this, and that he had been wrong about what he was looking for, and that if she was willing, he would spend whatever time he had making sure she did not regret staying. It was not a polished speech. There was a moment in the middle where he stopped and looked at the table, and then looked at her as though recalculating. It was the least rehearsed thing she had ever heard from him, which meant it was the truest thing. "I'm not the woman I was when I came here," she said, not to warn him, just because it was true and seemed like something he should know. "I know that," he said. "I'm not the man I was when you came here either." She thought about Pearl, who had arrived here with nothing and had acquired a brother, a sister, a sled, and a man who brought her firewood without being asked. She thought about herself, who had arrived with $11.40 and fear she hadn't fully acknowledged until it had begun to leave her. She thought about what it meant to choose something, rather than to survive it. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and the relief in his face was so unguarded she had to look away for a moment. They were married in November, 1 year and 1 week after Margot had climbed down from Seb's wagon in the yard and looked at this man who would not smile in this house that was solid and this life that was nothing like the one she had imagined. The ceremony was in Hartfield with Mrs. Bretchen from the way station in attendance. She had, it turned out, known Aldcroft for 15 years and had firm opinions about his needing someone sensible and hard as witness, standing with his hat in his hands and the cough finally gone from his chest. Bet wore her good dress and stood very straight the way she did, when she was feeling more than she intended to show. Croft stood beside Pearl, and at the part where Douglas Aldcroft put the ring on Margot's hand, Croft leaned over and whispered something in Pearl's ear that made her press her face into his shoulder to hide a smile. Margot would ask her later what he'd said. He said, "Now we're the same," Pearl told her. "We both have one of each." The years after were neither easy nor simple, because nothing in that country was easy or simple, and Margot had stopped expecting it to be. There were bad winters and uncertain springs, years when the cattle prices broke, and years when the hay didn't come in, and years when the machinery failed at the worst possible moment. There was a summer when Croft was 12 and went missing for 2 days in the high pasture, found finally, unhurt, having made a camp and studied the situation with a calm that was entirely his father's. And a winter when Pearl was 14 and decided she disagreed with a decision Margot had made, and made her feelings known in terms that left no room for interpretation. And there was the year the roof wanted replacing entirely, and they did it themselves in September, all of them, even Bet home from her first year of teaching school in a town 3 hours south. There were also mornings, hundreds of them, when she came downstairs to find him already at the table with the coffee made and the lamp turned up the right amount, and he would look up when she came in the way Bet had described. Not checking, just looking. And something in that look was the same at 40 as it had been at 34, and the same at 45, and the same every morning she could remember. She kept the ledgers for 30 years. The system she built in that first winter, comparing invoices to delivery logs, projecting revenues conservatively, flagging discrepancies before they compounded, became simply the way things were done. Neighboring ranchers asked occasionally how the Aldcroft books were managed so cleanly. She explained it without mystery, because it was not mysterious, only consistent. Pearl married a man from Medicine Hat who ran a small newspaper, and had, as Douglas observed dryly the first time he met him, opinions about everything except the things he should have opinions about, which meant he and Margot got along extremely well. Croft took over the North Pasture operation when Douglas's knees made the long rides impractical. Bet came home when her school district was absorbed by a larger one and ran the household accounts with such terrifying efficiency that Margot was slightly in awe of her and told her so. On a morning in September 31 years after she had read a solicitor's letter at a table in Lethbridge and found $11.40 between herself and the end of things, Margot sat on the porch of the house that had been built twice and repaired a dozen times and was hers in a way no document had ever made anything hers before. The mountains to the west had their first snow already, the peaks white against a sky that was that particular sharp blue it only got in the last weeks of summer. The ranch was alive below her. Cattle in the pasture, smoke from the cookhouse, Croft's son chasing the dog across the yard. Douglas came out and sat beside her. His hair was more gray now than it had been, and he moved with the consideration of someone whose joints had opinions, but he sat the same way he always had, quiet and present, and after a while he said, "What are you thinking about?" "The letter from the solicitor," she said. "The one that said everything was gone, and how it was right." She looked at the mountains. Everything was gone. Everything I'd had before. And then I came here and found something I hadn't had before. She turned to look at him, this man who had said, "We go to Calgary and I don't want conclusions," and yes to her single direct question more than 3 decades ago. "I'm glad the floor dropped out. I know that sounds strange." "It sounds like you," he said. She laughed, which she did more easily now than she had at 28. He was looking at her the way Bet had described. Not checking, just looking. And she thought, as she had thought on 100 mornings before this one, that she had not known what she was looking for when she packed 2 trunks in Lethbridge and bought a train ticket. She knew now. It had been this all along, waiting for her to find her way to it.